There's a particular kind of quiet that shows up when you don't know where you stand with someone. It's not the same as sadness, and it's not quite anxiety either, though it can feel like both at once. It's the specific discomfort of caring about someone and not having a clear answer about what happens next. If you're sitting in that right now, I want to talk about it honestly, without pretending I can tell you what's going on in someone else's head, because the truth is, no one can do that for you, not with certainty, not really. What I can talk about is what's happening in yours, because that part you actually have access to, and it's worth paying attention to. The first thing worth naming is that not knowing is genuinely hard. It's one of the more uncomfortable places a person can be, harder in some ways than a clean ending, because at least an ending gives you something to work with. Uncertainty doesn't. It just sits there, unresolved, and your mind, being the pattern-seeking thing that it is, keeps trying to solve it anyway. You replay conversations. When a relationship with a narcissist finally comes to an end, the silence that follows can feel almost unnatural. For so long, your life may have been filled with emotional noise. There were arguments that seemed to come from nowhere, sudden changes in affection, unanswered questions, accusations, apologies, promises, withdrawals, and moments when you could feel tension building before a single word was spoken. Then suddenly, it stops. The phone doesn't light up. There is no new argument, no unexpected apology, no accusation, no attempt to explain what happened, no message asking where you are, no familiar emotional storm waiting around the corner. At first, you might think the silence is peaceful. But then something strange happens. The silence itself begins to feel uncomfortable. You realize just how accustomed you had become to anticipating their next move. You had learned to read their moods. You knew when something was wrong by the way they entered a room. You noticed changes in their voice. You could tell when they were withdrawing affection. You watched their facial expressions during conversations. You monitored their responses because you knew that something small could suddenly become something enormous. Your mind had been trained to stay alert, so when the relationship ends, your body may not immediately understand that the emergency is over. Your environment has become quiet, but your mind is still listening for footsteps. You may find yourself checking your phone, even though you know there probably won't be a message. You may wonder whether they are going to contact you. You may check their social media. You may wonder who they are spending time with. You may imagine what they are saying about you. You may wonder whether they miss you. You may wonder whether they are angry. You may wonder whether they have already replaced you. And this is where the silence becomes psychologically complicated. Because silence creates an empty space, and the mind hates empty spaces when it is searching for certainty. When you don't have information, your brain starts creating possibilities. Maybe they're thinking about me. Maybe they're deliberately ignoring me. Maybe they want me to reach out. Maybe they're waiting for me to break first. Maybe they've completely moved on. Maybe they're happier now. Maybe I never meant anything to them. You can spend hours trying to answer questions that may never have definitive answers. And the more you think about them, the more connected you can continue to feel. This is why the end of a relationship doesn't always create immediate emotional separation. You can be physically away from someone while remaining psychologically connected to them. You may no longer live together. You may no longer speak. You may no longer see each other. But mentally, the relationship continues. You replay conversations. You remember their words. You analyze their behavior. You imagine what they might say if they contacted you. You imagine what you would say back. You think about whether they regret losing you. You imagine the moment they finally realize what they did. And without realizing it, your attention remains organized around them. That is one of the hardest parts of letting go. The relationship may have ended, but the habit of monitoring has not. For a long time, your emotional state may have depended on what they were doing. If they were affectionate, you felt relief. If they were distant, you felt anxiety. If they apologized, you felt hope. If they withdrew, you felt rejected. If they returned, you felt temporarily safe. Your nervous system learned to respond to their behavior. So when they disappear, you may initially feel lost because the external source of emotional information has suddenly vanished. There is nothing to interpret, nothing to respond to, nothing to fix, nothing to chase. And strangely enough, that can feel uncomfortable. You may even mistake the discomfort for missing them. But sometimes what you miss isn't the person. Sometimes you miss the emotional pattern your mind became accustomed to. You miss knowing what comes next, even when what came next was painful. Chaos can become familiar, uncertainty can become familiar, waiting can become familiar. And when familiarity disappears, peace can initially feel unfamiliar. This is why the first stage of silence may not feel peaceful at all. It may feel empty. It may feel confusing. It may even feel like something is missing from your day. But that emptiness isn't necessarily a sign that you should go back. It may be the space left behind when you stop spending your energy managing someone else's emotions. Think about how much mental energy may have gone into the relationship. What are they thinking? Are they upset? Should I text? Should I wait? Did I say something wrong? Why did their tone change? Why are they suddenly distant? Are they trying to punish me? How can I make things better? What can I do to bring back the person they were before? When the relationship ends, those questions don't automatically disappear. They can echo for a while. But eventually, something begins to change. Instead of asking what they are thinking, you start asking what you are thinking. Instead of asking whether they miss you, you ask whether you miss who you were before the relationship. Instead of asking whether they regret losing you, you ask what you regret losing in yourself. Maybe you stopped trusting your instincts. Maybe you became quieter. Maybe you stopped expressing your opinions. Maybe you became obsessed with keeping the peace. Maybe you stopped seeing friends. Maybe you stopped pursuing goals. Maybe you stopped doing things that once made you feel alive. Those are the pieces worth recovering, because healing isn't necessarily about making the other person understand your value. It is about remembering your value without requiring their recognition. The silence can eventually become something completely different. At first, it feels like absence. Then it becomes distance. Then it becomes breathing room, and eventually it can become freedom. You begin realizing that you don't have to anticipate someone's reaction before making a decision. You don't have to explain every feeling. You don't have to defend every boundary. You don't have to monitor another person's mood. You don't have to decode every message. You don't have to prove that you are worthy of love. You can simply exist. And that may be one of the strangest sensations after an emotionally exhausting relationship. You can make a decision because you want to make it. You can spend an evening without checking your phone. You can laugh without wondering whether someone will criticize you. You can make plans without calculating how another person might react. You can wake up without immediately wondering what emotional atmosphere awaits you. Little by little, your life becomes yours again. And that is why the silence deserves to be understood differently. Don't automatically interpret silence as rejection. Don't automatically interpret it as proof that they never cared. Don't automatically interpret it as evidence that they have forgotten you. Silence can simply mean that the interaction has stopped. What matters is what you do with the space that remains. You can fill it with more analysis, more checking, more theories, more imagined conversations, more waiting. Or you can fill it with yourself, your routines, your friendships, your goals, your boundaries, your interests, your future, your peace. Eventually, you may notice something remarkable. The phone can stay silent, and you don't feel the same urge to check it. Their name can appear somewhere, and your entire body doesn't react. You can hear about them without needing to know every detail. You can remember the relationship without wanting to return to it. And you can finally understand that closure was never going to arrive through one perfect conversation. Sometimes, closure is the gradual realization that you no longer need another person's behavior to tell you how to feel about your own life. The silence that once felt unnatural becomes normal. The empty space becomes yours, and the person who once occupied so much of your mental world slowly becomes a chapter rather than the entire story. That is when the silence stops being something you fear. It becomes evidence that the noise is finally over, and in that quiet, you begin hearing something you may not have heard clearly in a very long time, your own voice. One day, there is constant emotional noise, arguments, accusations, affection, withdrawal, confusion, and attempts to pull you back into the cycle. Then suddenly, nothing. No messages, no calls, no obvious attempts to reconnect, just silence. And almost immediately, your mind starts creating a story around that silence. Maybe they've moved on. Maybe they finally accepted the breakup. Maybe they never cared. Maybe they are happier without you. Maybe you meant less to them than you thought. But there is something important to understand about the difference between genuine emotional detachment and the disappearance of someone who has lost access to your attention. Silence does not automatically mean acceptance. Distance does not automatically mean emotional closure. And seeing someone appear perfectly fine does not tell you what is happening internally. A healthy person may eventually process a breakup by accepting the loss, grieving the relationship, taking responsibility for their part, and gradually building a life that no longer revolves around the former partner. Detachment happens through acceptance. The emotional bond slowly loosens because the person has confronted reality. But in a narcissistic dynamic, the breakup may be experienced through a completely different psychological lens. The central wound may not simply be, "I lost someone I loved." It may be, "I lost access to someone who made me feel important." That distinction changes everything. Because when the relationship ends, the narcissistic person may not immediately experience the loss as a normal separation between two human beings. They may experience it as a loss of control, attention, admiration, validation, status, or emotional influence. And that is why the silence can be misleading. They may disappear because they are waiting. They may withdraw because they want you to notice their absence. They may stop contacting you because they are testing whether you will eventually break the silence. They may appear completely unaffected because maintaining an image of indifference protects their ego. And sometimes they may genuinely redirect their attention towards someone else because another source of validation is available. But none of those behaviors necessarily mean the emotional dynamic has been resolved. This is where many people make a painful mistake. They interpret the narcissist's silence as proof that they have finally been forgotten. Then they begin questioning themselves. Maybe I didn't matter. Maybe they never cared. Maybe I was the only one affected. Maybe they are happier now. But your healing cannot depend on discovering what is happening inside another person's mind. The more important question is what happens inside you when you stop receiving information about them. Because narcissistic relationships often train people to monitor. You become accustomed to checking their mood, their messages, their social media, their reactions, their whereabouts, their attention, their silence, their new relationships. Their behavior becomes a kind of emotional weather system, and you spend your days checking the sky. Is the storm coming? Are they angry? Are they pulling away? Are they coming back? Are they trying to punish me? Do they miss me? Are they with someone else? That constant monitoring can continue even after the relationship ends. And this is why no contact can feel so uncomfortable at first. You are not simply missing the person. You are withdrawing from the habit of monitoring them. Your brain became accustomed to uncertainty. It became accustomed to searching for clues. It became accustomed to trying to predict what would happen next. When the information suddenly disappears, the mind wants to fill the empty space. It creates theories. It searches for explanations. It imagines conversations. It checks for signs. It tries to solve the person. But sometimes the most liberating thing you can do is stop solving them. You don't need to know whether they miss you. You don't need to know whether they are secretly angry. You don't need to know whether they are watching your social media. You don't need to know whether they regret losing you. You don't need to know whether they are trying to replace you, because every one of those questions keeps the psychological connection alive. You may have physically left the relationship while mentally remaining inside it, and that is the trap. The relationship can end in reality while continuing in your imagination. You replay conversations. You imagine what they might be thinking. You wonder what they will do next. You picture them realizing your value. You imagine the moment they finally regret everything. You wait for evidence that your absence affected them. And without realizing it, your healing becomes dependent upon their reaction. That gives them power long after they have physically left your life. Real freedom begins when their reaction stops being the measure of your recovery. Maybe they miss you. Maybe they don't. Maybe they regret losing you. Maybe they simply move toward another source of validation. Maybe they contact you again. Maybe they never do. None of those outcomes determines your worth. None of them changes what happened. None of them should determine whether you move forward. The most important shift is moving from "what are they feeling" to "what am I rebuilding?" because the relationship may have trained you to look outward. Healing asks you to look inward. What do you believe now? What boundaries did you abandon? What did you tolerate that you will never tolerate again? What parts of yourself became smaller? What did you stop doing because you were constantly managing someone else's emotions? What did you once love about yourself that disappeared during the relationship? Those are the questions that lead somewhere, and this is where the silence becomes something different. At first, silence feels like punishment. Later, it can become space. Space to think, space to breathe, space to remember who you were before every conversation became an emotional calculation, space to make decisions without anticipating someone's reaction, space to experience your own emotions without immediately wondering whether they will approve of them, space to become a person rather than a role in someone else's psychological drama. That is the part worth paying attention to. Because the end of the relationship isn't necessarily the end of the psychological battle. The real ending happens when you stop organizing your life around the other person's behavior. When you stop checking, stop decoding, stop waiting, stop proving, stop imagining, stop hoping for the perfect apology, stop needing them to understand what they did, and eventually you reach a strange but powerful realization. Their silence doesn't need an explanation anymore. It can simply be silence. Their absence doesn't need to mean anything about your value. It can simply be absence. Their future doesn't need to concern you. It is theirs. And yours is finally yours again. That is where the story truly changes. Not when they come back. Not when they regret losing you. Not when they finally admit what they did. But when you realize that you no longer need any of those things to move forward, because the ultimate form of detachment is not making someone else feel your absence, it is no longer needing them to notice it. It doesn't mean you're overreacting or being dramatic. It means you're a person who cares about an answer to a real question. But here's something worth sitting with. You can't actually think your way to certainty about another person's feelings. You can guess, you can hope, you can notice patterns, but their inner experience belongs to them, not to you. And no amount of analyzing texts or replaying memories is going to hand you a guarantee. That's not a comfortable thing to accept, but it's the truth, and there's actually something freeing in it once it settles. It means the exhausting work of trying to decode someone else from the outside was never going to fully work anyway. You can stop auditing every message for hidden meaning. You were never going to find the answer there. So what do you do instead? You start by getting honest about what you're actually holding right now. Not what you hope is true, not what you're afraid is true, just what you actually know. Maybe what you know is smaller than you'd like. Maybe it's just, I care about this person. I don't have clarity on where this is going, and that's uncomfortable. That's an honest starting point, and it's a lot more solid than a theory built on guesswork. From there, it helps to ask yourself a different kind of question. Not what are they feeling, but what do I actually need here? Sometimes what you need is information you don't currently have, which usually means an honest conversation, even though those conversations can feel terrifying to start. Sometimes what you need is simply time, because some situations really do need space to become clear, and no amount of internal analysis will speed that up. And sometimes, if you're honest with yourself, what you need is to stop putting your own peace on hold for someone else's timeline. That last one is worth sitting with for a second, because it's easy to slip into a pattern where your mood, your plans, even your sense of self-worth start orbiting around whether this other person reaches out, responds a certain way, or shows up the way you're hoping. When that happens, you've quietly handed a piece of your life over to someone who doesn't even know they're holding it. That's not a criticism. It happens to almost everyone at some point. But noticing it is the first step to taking that piece back, not because you've stopped caring, but because caring about someone and outsourcing your entire emotional state to them are two very different things. It's also worth being honest about the difference between hope and certainty, because they can feel remarkably similar from the inside, but they function very differently. Hope says, I don't know how this turns out, and I'm choosing to stay open to a good outcome while I live my life anyway. Certainty says, I already know how this ends, so I'm going to put things on hold until it happens. The first one lets you keep moving. The second one quietly traps you in a waiting room, sometimes for a very long time, based on a conclusion you never actually had enough information to reach. If you're waiting for someone to make a decision, sitting in a version of limbo neither fully in nor fully out, that in-between space is a genuinely difficult place to live in for very long. It's worth being honest with yourself about how long you're willing to stay there and what you actually want to do if the answer never becomes clear, or if it becomes clear in a direction you didn't want. That's not a pessimistic question. It's a practical one, and having an honest answer to it, even privately, tends to bring a surprising amount of relief. You're no longer entirely at the mercy of someone else's timeline. You've decided what you're willing to give this, and what happens if that's not met. I also want to say something about the specific ache of missing someone whose feelings you're unsure of, because that particular flavor of longing is a strange one. It's not just missing a person. It's missing the version of the situation where things felt clear, where you weren't constantly running calculations in your head. A lot of what feels unbearable about this kind of uncertainty isn't really about the other person at all. It's about how uncomfortable it is to not have an answer to something that matters to you. That discomfort is real, and it deserves some compassion, but it's also worth separating from the actual facts of the situation. You can feel a lot of longing for someone and still not have any real evidence about what they're feeling. Both of those things can be true at once, and it's worth not letting the intensity of the first one convince you of the second. There's also a difference worth naming between someone who is quietly working through their own feelings and will eventually be honest with you about where they land, and someone who has, in effect, already given you their answer through their actions, even if they haven't said it out loud. People do communicate through consistency, or the lack of it, even when they never say a clear sentence about what they want. If someone consistently shows up, reaches out, makes room for you, that's actual information. If someone is consistently vague, inconsistent, or absent, That's information too, even if it's not the information you were hoping for. It's tempting to explain away the second kind of pattern by imagining a rich inner life of fear and hidden longing behind it. And sometimes that inner life is real, but you don't have direct access to it, and you're not obligated to build your life around a version of someone's feelings that you've had to imagine because they haven't shown you. None of this means you have to give up on someone the moment things feel unclear. Real situations take time to sort out sometimes, and people really do have their own timing, their own fears, their own reasons for moving slowly. But there's a real difference between giving a situation reasonable time to develop and quietly putting your entire emotional life on pause indefinitely while you wait for someone else to decide something. One of those is patience. The other one is a kind of self-abandonment dressed up as patience, and it's worth being able to tell the two apart. If you're in the middle of this right now, here's something that might actually help more than any amount of analyzing. Bring your attention back to your own life, not as a strategy to make the other person miss you, not as some kind of tactic to seem unbothered, but because your life is actually happening right now, today, regardless of what this other person decides. The people around you, the things you're working toward, the version of yourself you're building, none of that has to wait for clarity about one relationship. It's not that this connection doesn't matter, it's that it isn't the only thing that matters, even when it feels that way in the middle of the uncertainty. Something also happens when you stop performing calm and start actually finding it. There's a difference between forcing yourself to seem unaffected while secretly checking your phone every few minutes and genuinely redirecting your energy toward your own life because you've decided that's where it belongs right now. The first one is exhausting and doesn't really work. The second one is quieter, and it tends to change how you feel even when the outside situation hasn't changed at all yet. You start sleeping better. You start noticing other parts of your life again. The uncertainty is still there, but it stops being the only thing in the room. It's worth saying clearly, wanting an answer isn't wrong, and it's not weak to want clarity from someone you care about. You're allowed to want that, and you're allowed to ask for it directly, even if that feels vulnerable. A direct, honest question, asked without demanding a particular answer, is often the most respectful thing you can do for yourself and for the other person. It gives them the chance to be honest, and it gives you real information instead of guesswork. Not everyone will answer that question the way you want, but you'll know something true instead of living inside a theory. And knowing something true, even something disappointing, is almost always easier to carry than not knowing at all. And if the answer, when it comes, isn't the one you were hoping for, that's not a referendum on your worth. It usually just means this person, at this point in their life, wasn't able to meet what you were offering, for reasons that may have very little to do with you specifically. That's a real loss, and it deserves to be felt rather than immediately explained away or minimized. But it's not evidence that something is wrong with you, and it's not proof that you were foolish for caring. Caring about someone honestly is never the mistake, even when it doesn't lead where you hoped. If the answer turns out to be a good one, that's worth enjoying without needing to have predicted it perfectly in advance. You don't have to have known all along. You're allowed to have felt uncertain the whole time and still end up somewhere good. Uncertainty along the way doesn't undo a good outcome, and it doesn't mean you handled things wrong by not being sure sooner. Either way, the thing most worth protecting right now is your own steadiness. Not a performance of not caring, and not a forced kind of positivity, just an honest commitment to keep living your life, tending to the people and things that are actually in front of you, while this particular question works itself out on its own timeline, whatever that ends up looking like. You don't need to have this figured out today. You just need to keep being someone whose life doesn't fully stop while you wait to find out.